What if the economic collapse everyone's waiting for has already begun, but it's happening so quietly that most people don't even realize it? Politicians and economists point to this number as proof that the worst is behind us. But here's what they don't tell you. Still, these adaptations come with limitations. Personal adjustments cannot fully counteract systemic pressures, nor can they replace the stability that comes from healthy wages, predictable housing costs, and manageable utilities. What they do provide, however, is a measure of resilience, enough to weather short-term disruptions while the broader economy struggles to find balance. As more people adopt this survival mindset, it becomes clear that the challenge is no longer just about affordability. It's about navigating a landscape where the rules of financial security are being rewritten in real time. The most important insight from tonight's analysis is this. What we're experiencing is not a temporary economic adjustment or a normal business cycle downturn. It's a fundamental restructuring of the American economic system and the cost of living within it. When you examine everything together, a clear picture emerges. The United States cost of living crisis is not driven by a single factor, but by the combined weight of rising utilities, record household debt, and wages that can no longer keep up. These pressures have reshaped daily life, pushing more families into financial insecurity and revealing economic collapse signs long before they appear in official reports. Housing has become harder to afford, savings have become harder to build, and even the most essential bills have become harder to manage. This is the reality millions navigate each month, the true consequence of a cost of living crisis that continues to deepen. That 3% figure represents an average. And when you dig into the components, you discover that the things families actually need have increased by much more than 3%. The question facing every American family is no longer whether this crisis will affect them, but how quickly they can adapt to a new reality where traditional financial wisdom no longer guarantees security. The families who understand these changes and adjust their strategies accordingly will have the best chance of maintaining stability through this transition. Those who continue to rely on outdated financial assumptions may find themselves increasingly vulnerable to economic shocks they never saw coming. Before you fall into comfortable assumptions about your own financial security, ask yourself whether the long-term trends we've documented tonight fit your personal and financial reality. The warning signs are already visible for those who know what to look for. Next week, we'll examine the 3 sectors of the American economy that are showing the most dangerous signs of strain and reveal the specific strategies that financial professionals are quietly recommending to their wealthiest clients to protect against what could be the most significant economic disruption in American history. If tonight's analysis helped you understand the real scope of what's happening to American families right now, make sure you're prepared for what comes next. Food costs climbed by more than 3% during the same period. Energy costs continued rising. Services, everything from childcare to home repairs, grew more expensive, not less. This creates what economists call a lived experience gap. The macro data may have softened, but household budgets never got the memo. Here's the critical insight that changes everything. When families say groceries feel 20% more expensive, they're not exaggerating. They're reacting to the cumulative weight of 3 straight years of rising prices. When a gallon of milk costs slightly more, when produce prices creep up bit by bit, when pantry staples rise month after month, it creates a financial environment where paychecks stretch thinner, and the margin for error simply disappears. And here's the part that will shock you the most. The story repeats with utilities, but on a scale that most Americans never anticipated. Don't miss what comes next, because we're about to reveal how basic services like electricity and water have become the hidden destroyers of the American household budget. Among all the rising costs squeezing American households, utilities have emerged as the most shocking source of financial pressure. Electricity, water, gas, sewer, and basic energy services, once predictable monthly expenses, now behave like major debt obligations. Tonight, we're going to show you the data that proves millions of American families are living through the most dangerous financial transformation in 3 generations. According to national data that most news outlets haven't fully reported, More than 14 million households entered 2025 with overdue utility balances significant enough to risk service interruption. The average amount in arrears climbed to nearly $790, a level that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. This is not just a story of higher prices. It's a story of essential services breaking the household budget entirely. The cost of electricity alone has risen faster than overall inflation for several consecutive years, driven by grid upgrades, fuel costs, climate extremes, and regional rate adjustments that pile up faster than most families can absorb. Water systems across dozens of states have increased fees to cover aging infrastructure, leaving families shocked when monthly bills resemble a car payment instead of a basic necessity. Now, as promised, here are the 3 warning signs that indicate your household may be at risk of joining this growing crisis. First warning sign: your utility bills now consume more than 15% of your monthly take-home pay. This used to be considered the danger threshold for housing costs. Now it applies to utilities alone. If you're spending more than $400 a month on electricity, water, gas, and basic services, you're in the danger zone. Second warning sign: you've started choosing which bills to pay each month, rather than simply paying all your obligations. When families begin calculating which bill can be late without losing heat, water, or electricity, that's not budgeting, that's crisis management. Third warning sign: your household savings rate has dropped to 0 or below, despite earning the same or even higher income than previous years. When rising costs consume income growth entirely, it creates a dangerous vulnerability that most families don't recognize until it's too late. You won't need a government report or Wall Street forecast to understand what's happening. All you need is your latest grocery receipt, your electric bill, or that credit card statement you've been avoiding. If any of these warning signs sound familiar, you're witnessing firsthand what millions of Americans are experiencing right now. But the utility crisis is only the beginning. What's happening in housing markets across the country represents an even deeper threat to long-term financial stability. A growing number of Americans report receiving shut-off warnings or entering payment plans simply to keep basic services running. These are not isolated incidents. When millions of households struggle with utility payments simultaneously, it signals a systematic breakdown in the relationship between income and essential costs. The housing market tells an even more troubling story. Over the past 4 years, median home prices have increased by approximately 40% nationwide. Meanwhile, mortgage rates have reached levels not seen in more than 20 years. The combination of higher prices and higher rates has created a situation where the monthly payment on an average American home now requires nearly double the income it did just 4 years ago. For perspective, a household that could comfortably afford a $350,000 home in 2021 would need to earn substantially more today to afford that same property. But here's where the crisis deepens beyond simple affordability metrics. The rental market, traditionally seen as a refuge for those priced out of homeownership, has experienced its own affordability collapse. Rental rates have increased faster than wage growth in virtually every major metropolitan area. According to housing analysts, approximately 40% of renters now spend more than 30% of their income on housing costs alone. This threshold, known as the housing burden ratio, was historically considered the warning line between stable and unstable housing situations. When 40% of renters cross that line, it indicates a housing system under severe stress. The consequences ripple through every aspect of household financial planning. For millions of households across America, everyday life has stopped being manageable. It's become a monthly calculation of what can be paid this month and what must wait. Families that might have built emergency savings or invested in education or retirement instead find themselves dedicating larger portions of income simply to maintaining shelter. Many have been forced to make difficult choices, accepting longer commutes to find affordable housing, sharing living spaces with extended family, or postponing major life decisions like marriage or starting a family. What makes this housing crisis particularly dangerous is that it's hitting households that followed traditional financial wisdom. These aren't families who overextended themselves or made risky financial decisions. They're people who saved for down payments, maintained good credit scores, and earn steady incomes. Yet they find themselves priced out of markets they could afford just a few years ago. This represents a fundamental shift in how the American economy rewards responsible financial behavior. When traditional pathways to stability no longer function as expected, it forces millions of families to reconsider everything they thought they knew about building financial security. But housing costs represent only one part of a much larger transformation taking place in American household finances. The debt crisis building quietly in the background may pose the greatest long-term threat of all. Don't miss what we're about to reveal about how debt has become the hidden bridge, keeping millions of families afloat, and why that bridge is showing dangerous signs of strain. While housing and utility costs squeeze budgets from one direction, American households are turning to debt in unprecedented ways to bridge the gap between income and expenses. The most shocking revelation? This isn't happening to people who made bad financial decisions. It's happening to families who followed every piece of traditional financial advice. The numbers tell a sobering story that few financial experts are discussing openly. Mortgage balances have reached record highs, not just because of higher home prices, but because buyers are borrowing larger percentages of home values and extending loan terms to manage monthly payments. Credit card debt has never been larger in nominal terms, with the average household carrying balances that would have been considered dangerous just a generation ago. Student loan delinquencies are rising again after years of pandemic-related pauses, as borrowers discover that their improved financial situations during the pause period have been completely eroded by rising costs in other areas of life. What's particularly concerning to financial analysts is how debt is being used differently than in previous economic cycles. Traditionally, households took on debt to purchase assets, invest in education, or fund business opportunities. Today, increasing numbers of families report using credit cards, personal loans, and even home equity lines of credit to cover basic monthly expenses. This shift from asset-building debt to survival debt represents a fundamental change in how American families manage financial pressures. When debt becomes the primary tool for covering routine living expenses, it creates a dangerous feedback loop. Monthly debt service payments increase, which reduces available income for basic needs, which leads to greater reliance on debt, which increases monthly payments further. In the next 30 minutes, you'll discover why official inflation numbers tell only half the story, how utility bills have become the new mortgage payments, and why even people earning six figures are struggling to stay afloat. Breaking this cycle becomes increasingly difficult when wages remain relatively flat while essential costs continue rising. The psychological impact of this debt burden extends far beyond monthly budget calculations. Financial stress affects decision-making, family relationships, health outcomes, and long-term planning capabilities. When families live with constant awareness that they're one emergency away from crisis, it changes how they approach everything from career decisions to healthcare to retirement planning. Here's what makes the current debt situation particularly dangerous compared to previous cycles. Interest rates have risen significantly from historic lows, making new debt more expensive and existing variable rate debt more burdensome to service. Credit card annual percentage rates have reached levels not seen in decades, meaning that families relying on credit to bridge budget gaps face mounting interest obligations that can quickly overwhelm household finances. At the same time, lenders have begun tightening credit standards, making it harder for struggling households to access the credit they've become dependent upon. This creates a potential squeeze where families face higher costs for existing debt while finding it more difficult to obtain new credit to manage cash flow challenges. The implications extend beyond individual households to the broader economic system. But most importantly, at exactly 5 minutes in, we'll reveal the 3 specific warning signs that indicate whether your household is at risk of joining the 14 million American families who are already one emergency away from financial catastrophe. When large numbers of families simultaneously reduce discretionary spending to service debt and cover essential expenses, it reduces demand for goods and services across the entire economy. This demand reduction can trigger business slowdowns, employment reductions, and further pressure on household incomes. What we're witnessing may be the early stages of a deflationary spiral, where reduced consumer spending leads to lower economic growth, which leads to further pressure on household finances. The wage stagnation that underlies much of this crisis deserves special attention because it represents the foundation upon which all other financial pressures build. Don't miss our analysis of why even families earning what should be comfortable, middle-class incomes are struggling to maintain basic financial stability. The wage stagnation crisis runs deeper than most Americans realize. While official unemployment figures suggest a healthy labor market, the quality and purchasing power of employment tells a very different story. Real wages, adjusted for inflation, have essentially flatlined for most workers despite reported economic growth and corporate profitability. This means that even households with stable employment and regular income increases find themselves falling behind the cost of living curve. A typical middle-class family today might see their gross income increase by 2 or 3% annually, which sounds reasonable until you calculate that their essential expenses, housing, utilities, food, transportation, healthcare are increasing by significantly more than 3% annually. The result is a gradual erosion of purchasing power that happens slowly enough that families often don't recognize it until they're forced to make difficult choices about basic needs. Right now, across the United States, something unprecedented is unfolding. This purchasing power erosion affects different demographic groups in different ways, creating a complex pattern of financial stress across American society. Older Americans living on fixed incomes face particularly acute challenges. Social Security cost of living adjustments and pension increases typically lag behind real expense growth, turning what was meant to be a stable chapter of life into a constant financial puzzle. Fixed incomes that once covered housing, medication, utilities, and groceries now fall short, forcing difficult trade-offs. Some seniors have begun skipping medical appointments or stretching prescriptions simply to stay within budget. Working families feel the strain just as sharply, but in different ways. Parents who once managed their bills with relative ease now find themselves recalculating every purchase, delaying car repairs, or downsizing daily routines to preserve financial stability. A growing number report receiving delinquency notices or warnings from utility providers, not because of irresponsible spending, but because their income can no longer cover the basics without slipping into debt. Younger households face a different version of adulthood than the one they were promised. Many are postponing plans for homeownership, starting a family, or building savings, not due to lack of ambition, but because the financial threshold for stability keeps rising faster than they can keep up. Their vision of the future has narrowed into a month-to-month reality where long-term planning becomes a luxury they cannot afford. For the past 3 years, we've been told repeatedly that inflation was cooling, easing, normalizing. The official Consumer Price Index for 2025 shows a year-over-year increase of roughly 3%. These personal stories may not appear in official surveys, yet they illustrate what data alone cannot capture. The emotional weight of living in an economy where every choice feels constrained. The numbers explain the pressure. The lived experiences reveal its consequences. Together, they show how deeply the current environment is reshaping the everyday lives of millions. In an environment where costs rise faster than paychecks and stability feels increasingly uncertain, many Americans are adjusting not by choice, but by necessity. This shift is less about financial strategy and more about survival, a recalibration of how households manage risk, prioritize expenses, and prepare for volatility that has become the new normal. One of the most noticeable changes is the rise in self-reliance. Tasks once outsourced to service professionals, home repairs, maintenance work, basic inspections, are now being handled personally to avoid additional costs. Families are learning skills they never expected to need simply to reduce monthly expenses. Others have begun simplifying their lifestyles, cutting subscriptions, reducing discretionary purchases, or seeking alternative ways to stretch essential budgets. Savings, while harder to build, have taken on greater importance. Households that can manage even modest contributions to an emergency fund report feeling better equipped to handle unexpected expenses. Meanwhile, some Americans are turning toward assets perceived as more stable, not as speculative investments, but as a way to preserve purchasing power in an uncertain environment.